The film begins with the main character, Gary King, and his 4 friends, Oliver, Peter, Stephen, and Andy, enjoying the time of their lives. Gary is telling psychiatrists and other individuals sitting with him about his experience. He tells them about how much fun they had in their youth and how they plan to tackle the Golden Mile, which is 12 bars and a long trail of drunken pleasure. He describes every pub they visited when they were young in order to accomplish the task they set for themselves. But the destiny he mentions is the World's End, which is the final bar they intended to visit, but couldn't. When they started their journey, they hit the pubs one by one, having fun, drinking, and enjoying their lives to the fullest. Gary King knew that this life would never feel this good again. The flashback ends here. Years later, Gary is sitting with psychologists, explaining everything they did that night. But they were unable to reach the World's End pub. A man sitting with him asks him if he had any regrets about not completing his challenge. He replies no, with an excited face. After a while, these 4 friends are seen with their families, businesses, and going about their everyday lives, while Gary King gets dressed. He departs to meet with his friends to prepare them to finish their half-finished gold mine challenge. First, he meets Peter, who runs his father's company. Peter agrees to go with Gary for the Golden Miles when Gary insists. Second, he meets Stephen, a building engineer. He also agrees to travel with Gary. Olivia agrees as well, but when Gary meets with Andy, he refuses to attend, since he had quit drinking due to an accident. When Andy refuses once again, Gary tells him about his mother, who died a few days earlier. That manages to convince him. 4 of them are now preparing to go for their homeland, Newton Heaven. When they get to Newton's Heaven, Gary announces that they are on their way to completing the Golden Mile. No one recognizes them when they arrive at the bar. Gary orders 5 glasses of beer, but Andy refuses to drink and instead requests water. They then travel to another bar, where Andy declines to drink once again. While they are seated together, Oliver discovers that her sister Sam is also in Newton Heaven, so he invites her to the bar. Gary and Stephen are overjoyed after learning about Sam. They recall Gary and Stephen fighting for Sam in the past. After a time, Sam joins them and is pleased to see these friends together. But when she goes to the bathroom, Gary follows her. He informs her that she gave him the clue to come here, to which Sam slaps Gary and storms out of the bar. They now proceed to the next pub, but the management prevents them from entering, since Gary has been barred from this establishment. Gary notices a glass of beer outside the pub before leaving and drinks it to accomplish his goal. They now proceeded to the 4th tavern, where they begin to recall how they used to celebrate the new year at this pub. During their conversation, a man called Shane enters and asks Peter for the chair. Peter is taken aback and tells everyone that Shane used to taunt him in school and that he no longer recognizes him. Gary asks for the shots from everyone, but Andy becomes enraged and decides to leave the Golden Mile and return home. Gary becomes agitated and walks to the restroom, but he leaves his phone on the table. Andy is irritated when he discovers his mother's call on Gary's phone. Gary had just lied to him about his mother. The boy begins arguing with Gary while he was using the restroom. Gary tried to fight back, but the boy was just too powerful. Gary stabbed his skull on the wall, separating his head from his body and causing blue-colored blood to ooze out of him. Gary is stunned after witnessing this, and his friends appear and begin shouting at Gary for lying about Andy's mother. Suddenly, the man that Gary eliminated rises without his head and begins fighting anew. After some time, Gary and his friends are surprised when several additional boys, including the deceased one, arrive and begin fighting with Gary and his friends. They fight back and take everyone out. Gary informs everyone that Newton Haven is probably populated by these robots. These 5 friends began arguing with one another, and they now realize that these robots are linked to each other. After a bit, they came out of the restroom warily to see whether everything was okay outside. They then return to finish their drinks, and Andy swallows all 5 shots at once. Gary is concerned that if the cops spot them with blue blood and drinks, they would be arrested. A police officer approaches them and inquires if their Golden Mile was completed, to which they answered that it was not. Gary then orders everyone to keep the challenge going, or the residents of Newton Haven will suspect them. The others disagree and want to go home, but Gary tells them not to. They are drunk and shouldn't leave Andy alone. Andy becomes enraged and drinks all of the shots on the table. They decide to go to the 5th bar, and when they arrive, everyone is staring at them strangely. They drink wine and walk to the 6th bar, where Oliver goes to the restroom, and the others start talking about how much their families would suffer if they didn't make it out alive. Gary sees Trevor, whom he refers to as Reverend Green, since he used to offer them weed when they were younger. He attempts to talk to him, and Andy assumes he was going to obtain drugs. But Gary claims he only wants to talk about the problem, since he's the only person he recognizes. Gary communicates with Trevor in sign language, but Trevor speaks carefully, since he is under the control of robotic people. After some while, Trevor receives a phone call from his boss, who tells him something over the phone, and he discreetly exits the bar with a solemn expression on his face. When they visited the 2nd bar after leaving the first one, the owner recognizes him, which leads Gary and his companions to become a little leery. Gary hears Sam talking to someone at the pub and follows her. Sam becomes irritated, but Gary accompanies her to the restroom and inquires about the twins, who accompany Sam constantly and watch her every move. Sam orders Gary to go because she doesn't trust him, but he follows her to a table. There, she talks to the twin sisters, who were curious about the chat she had with Gary. Sam questions him about the matter, but Steve interrupts and begins telling Sam how much he loves her. One of the twin sisters enters the room in the middle of their talk. She starts arguing with Sam because she looks creepy. When Sam needs aid from Steve, the situation became chaotic. Steve then eliminates the twin sister by removing her head. At this point, Gary instructs his friends to head to the 8th bar, which serves as a school disco and is where all the students are dancing. Gary himself follows them until Oliver arrives and gives her sister a drink of wine. Sam asks Stephen about what he had said to her in the garden. However, an elderly guy abducts Stephen and imprisons him in a chamber. Stephen receives a whole lecture about the history of Newton Haven from the elderly guy, as Oliver begins to control Gary and his other friends by keeping them preoccupied with flirtatious women. He also phones Adrian Keene, Sam's ex-boyfriend, who passed away in an accident 8 years prior. Sam and Gary flee the scene together with their friends after realizing something was wrong. They head to bar number 8, where they run across their college's principal, who welcomes them in for a drink and conversation. The principal explains to them that the individuals they are referring to as robots are actually aliens who are assisting them, and they should be supported. Oliver agrees with the teacher, which alarms Andy and Gary. Andy becomes angry and attacks Oliver with a chair, proving that Oliver, too, was a robot, who was informing other robots about their intentions. Other robots arrive to help Oliver, but Gary and his pals depart, and Gary drives Sam away, telling her to leave in the car. Gary returns to his friends and challenges them to show that they are indeed human. They all show each other their wounds, because the robots never acquire wounds. Gary and his friends set out to complete the Golden Mile, but as soon as they step outside, all of the robots began to pursue them. The robots capture Peter and transform him into a robot, which enraged Gary, Andy, and Stephen. Andy requests Gary to return, but Gary refuses, which angers Andy and prompts him to beat Gary, lift him up on his shoulders, and go. Andy runs to the 10th bar to join them, but Gary awakens and resumes drinking beer to finish the Golden Mile. Andy asks Gary to leave Golden Mile behind and continue on his way, but Gary refuses and begins racing toward the next pub. Unfortunately, Andy pursues him, despite his desire not to. The robots are all pursuing them, but Gary doesn't give up. Andy is assaulted by a large alien, but the other robots destroy him. Gary rushes for the final bar, which marks the end of the world. Gary takes the entire glass of wine to drink, but Andy stops him, and they both begin fighting. Suddenly, the final pub's structure is destroyed, and the entire situation changes. Many robots stand around Gary and Andy, watching them. The network begins telling Gary about how they intended to make everyone look like them, so that they would never grow old or contract illnesses. The network displays a young Gary in front of him. The young Gary invites the actual Gary to join them, so that he never dies or gets old, but Gary rejects. Gary requests that the network leaves the Earth and humanity alone, but the network refuses, and states that there is no world without the network. Gary begins arguing with Nebula, and asks him to leave the Earth again. Once the network was gone, the region began to inflate, and Sam appears out of nowhere to save Gary and Stephen, and take them with her. However, when the network dissolves, an electrostatic pulse is formed, and everything is destroyed. Because of the network's rebirth, the entire globe burns. All of the aliens on the network have vanished, and the artificial people are reverting to human form. After some time, Andy is shown sitting around a bonfire with his children, giving them the entire network story. They've gone through a nuclear catastrophe, and Andy admits to missing Gary at the very end. So, it's taken all of that for him to begin romanticizing the past. On top of that, they will never see each other again. Everyone is enjoying their old age, since there is no networking. People who had become robots begin to revert to human form. Oliver resumes his career, Peter becomes a human, and Stephen and Sam, now married to each other, reside in London. But no one knows about Gary. After a while, Gary is seen with his robotic companions in a pub, where he orders water but is rejected by the proprietor. Gary begins arguing with the owner, and the film ends.